There's more bread this week. So as we listen, may God open our eyes to see, our ears to hear, and our hearts to love. Jesus said to the disciples, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The images of bread and life and manna in the wilderness from last week's lectionary continue into this week's passage. The Gospel writer intentionally links Jesus' story with the faith of the Hebrew people wandering in the wilderness. The story of God's sustaining manna there becomes enfleshed and enhanced in Jesus. Jesus has become the channel through which God is more deeply heard, more deeply understood. So the Gospel writer begins with a story with which the people are familiar, a truth they already believe, and moves them to a new understanding of the way in which the holy is now known in Jesus. In this case, the bread that nourishes is enduring, living, breathing, dynamic bread that brings eternal life, life at its deepest, life through which meaning is forged. Jesus is offering relationship that moves and grows with the people of faith, which will sustain them in an unknown future. Each section of John's Gospel is a variation of the single theme that the promised one offers this life to all who believe this offer and embrace it. But this offer is not uncontroversial, and dealing with rejection of the offer is an important sub-theme in John's Gospel. In the version that we heard read, the opponents of Jesus were described as the religious leaders. However, in most English language translations, they are referred to as the Jews. But the Jews, who like Israel in the wilderness, murmur and grumble about Jesus, these Jews are really only some of the Jews, because of course Jesus and his disciples are also Jews. But these Jews, the unbelieving ones, the guardians of the temple power, find the claim of Jesus to have come down from heaven offensive. They know his parents. Jesus addresses their unwillingness to understand what Jesus is about. Only those whom God draws come to Jesus. Only they are taught by God and therefore come. It sounds like a closed system with no possibility of border crossing. There are huge problems in this text if we read it as an exclusionary system in which some are destined to respond and some not. Such a system would contradict other parts of the gospel. The same gospel that uses this language of those who are given or drawn by God also claims that anyone can believe, and then proceeds to identify those who choose to believe as the ones who then join the ranks of those who are given and drawn. There's contradiction. Australian theologian Bill Loader suggests it's easier to understand such language if we look at the positive statements. Those who respond are special. One way of saying that they are special is to describe them as chosen or given. It's similar to the kind of language that we find in romance fiction or film, when somebody declares that their true love is their only possible partner in the whole world. You were meant for me. But the chances are really that they could have found a number of acceptable partners in their life. We understand the way those affirmations work, though. They're not accurate descriptions, but celebratory statements. What they are doing is more important than what they are literally saying. John's Gospel, though, comes to terms with the refusal of many Jews to accept the gospel by employing these categories of exclusion. But it is dangerous language, and John uses it often. The most striking use is on the lips of Jesus in John chapter 8, where Jesus declares of the Jews that they are the devil's children. And we also heard a reference to the devil in the reading that Des read from Ephesians, where it's used metaphorically as the opposite of kindness. But loosened from its context, words describing a group of people as the devil's children opened the door to anti-Semitism. And even within its own context, such language is not unproblematic, and it requires careful exposition. If it's hard for us to understand the idea of a devil, we do understand the idea of bedeviling. It's easy to bedevil those who disagree with us, effectively declaring them hopeless cases and writing them off. We do that with politicians who perpetuate injustice against refugees. I know that I sometimes do it with conservative Christians who oppose the full inclusion of LGBTIQ people within the church. The good news in this gospel, though, is that this is precisely not God's approach to humankind. And yet the presence of such language in the biblical text has been the warrant of some of Christianity's worst abuses. This is one of the many passages in John's Gospel that has contributed to Christian intolerance and persecution of people of other faiths, especially of Jews. The appalling history of Christian anti-Semitism requires that we do not simply attempt to understand what this passage means on its own terms, but that we commit ourselves to undoing everything in our religion that contributes to the othering of the religions of others. Some members of our congregation are involved in dialogue and relationship building with people of other faiths. This work is crucial for overcoming the kind of enmity and distrust that at its worst can lead to hate and violence. It is the kind of conversation that Christians should have had with Jews throughout history, the kind of conversation that might have prevented the Holocaust. So as profound as this text is in John's Gospel, as profound as it might be in turning us toward Jesus in order to understand the sacred, we can no longer read it without addressing Christian anti-Semitism and all violence against religious, racial, and sexual others. The bread of life is a gift to us, but it is a gift that requires a response, a commitment to getting to know those who are seen as other in our community and standing with them in solidarity when they are targeted because of their difference. But we should also tell the stories of hope and transformation. One of the people who inspires me in this area is Valerie Kaur, who is an American civil rights activist, a lawyer, and a practitioner of the Sikh religion. This week is the 6th anniversary of the attack on a Sikh Gurdwara, or temple, that happened in Wisconsin in the United States, where 6 worshippers were gunned down by a white supremacist. The shooter dehumanized people who were of a particular religious faith, people who, because of their distinctive appearance, were a target. Initially, media stories and the Sikhs themselves suggested that the killing was a case of mistaken identity, assuming that the killer had believed that peaceful Sikhs were in fact Muslim. Valerie Kaur was disturbed by the implications of this narrative. She realized that identifying the problem as mistaken identity was dangerous. Mistaken identity implied that there was in fact a correct target, and it implied that hate and violence could be legitimately directed at Muslims. And it also missed the bigger picture, that we must end violence against all people, Muslim, Sikh, and everyone else, and build a world without terror. So the Sikh community made a commitment to express active solidarity with Muslims. And although they are distinct religious communities, they have shared experience of hate, violence, religious bigotry, and racial profiling. In a Washington Post article, Valerie Kaur spoke of connecting the dots between all the incidences of violence that have hate at their core. And among the list of names of people killed because of their difference was the name of Matthew Shepard, the young gay man who was beaten, tied to a fence, and left to die in rural Wyoming in 1998. Reading that article, I was moved because I have seldom, if ever, heard religious minorities make connections between hate and misunderstanding directed at them and homophobia. Since that time, 6 years ago, more horrible incidences of violence against minorities have happened, and they appear to have been increasing with the rise of nationalism and white supremacy that is legitimised by political leaders such as Donald Trump. And we are not immune from this in Australia, and it comes not just from one nation, but from Malcolm Turnbull and Peter Dutton demonising South Sudanese migrants, and Barnaby Joyce suggesting that white people are more deserving of the support of the social safety net than others. Last year, Valerie Kaur did a TED talk titled 3 Lessons of Revolutionary Love in a Time of Rage. The talk was delivered a year after the installation of Donald Trump as president. She recognised that to say that love is the answer is a trite response unless we put flesh on the bones of love, unless our love is embodied as Jesus's was when he offered himself as bread for the world. Kaur says revolutionary love is the choice to enter into labour for others who do not look like us. Also, though, to enter into love for our opponents who hurt us, and to love ourselves. In this era of enormous rage, when fires are burning all around us, she says, I believe that revolutionary love is the call for our time. So her first lesson in revolutionary love is that stories can help us see no stranger, see no one as a stranger. And she learned about that in making a film in which she told the story of Balbir Singh Sodhai, a friend of her family who was gunned down at the petrol station where he worked. He was the first person killed in retaliation for 9/11, murdered by a man who called himself a patriot. And she covered in the film the story of the response of his widow. And she asked her, what would you like to tell the American people in response to what happened to your husband? And she said, thank you. And Valerie asked her, thank you? What do you mean? And she said, I want to say thank you to the thousands of Americans who came to my husband's funeral because they showed me who we are. Kaur's second lesson in revolutionary love is about forgiveness. She locates in forgiveness of those who hurt us, but not a facile, easy forgiveness. The story of forgiveness that she told took 15 years to happen. She locates the struggle not directly against individual perpetrators, but against the culture and philosophies that have radicalised them. And she practiced forgiveness together with the brother of Balbir Singh Sodhai when they made the decision to contact his murderer in prison 15 years later after his death. And as a result of that encounter and the conversation, she says, forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from hate. And her third lesson in revolutionary love is loving ourselves, including allowing the expression of anger. This resonated for me with the reading from Ephesians, which does not identify anger as a sin, but as a legitimate emotion that may or may not lead to sin. The writer says, be angry, but do not sin. Kaur says, for too long we have been told to suppress rage, suppress grief in the name of love and forgiveness. But when we suppress our rage, that's when it hardens into hate, directed outward sometimes, but usually directed inward. She says that all of our emotions are necessary. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger, she says, is the force that protects love. The third lesson in revolutionary love is to love ourselves, to breathe through the fire of pain and refuse to let it harden into hate. So in order to love others, see no one as stranger. In order to love our opponents, see the wounds in the one who hurt you. In order to love yourself, feel joy, feel grief, feel anger, breathe and push through the pain, because as Carl says, you are brave. Jesus' words in John's Gospel, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me has eternal life," were not meant to be words of condemnation, but words of encouragement, words of absolute confidence in the God who holds all of our lives. Our religious belief does not require agreement with certain proposals. Our religious belief asks of us to be in a state of relationship with God and with others and with ourselves. The gift of mana is precisely that. It is a gift for all people, inviting us to the practice of Jesus, the practice of revolutionary love, no matter our race or creed or religion, our gender or sexuality. This mana is for the whole world, and every body is sacred. Amen.